Welcome to this episode of What's Wrong with the Skeptic's Argument. Recently, I was preparing to give a talk on the problem of miracle when I came across this tweet from Paulogia. He claims that I'm not saying miracles are impossible. I'm saying I could never be convinced of one based on testimony alone. That the witness is lying or mistaken is always going to be more probable, and hearsay increases the problem exponentially. So what's wrong with the skeptic's argument? The first claim he makes is that the witness is lying or mistaken is always going to be more probable than a miracle, say for example the resurrection of Jesus, happened based on evidence from testimony alone. But why? Now, Paulogia did not actually explain why. When I asked him over email, he also did not reply. In fact, he has not replied to my email ever since I pointed out some mistakes in his arguments back in March. But Paulogia did mention David Hume elsewhere, so I suspect that he got his view from Hume. Now, Hume says, when anyone tells me that he saw a dead person restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or the fact which he relates should really have happened. Another philosopher called Ratios expressed Hume's idea this way. Firstly, we know that often people get things wrong, make mistakes, exaggerate, and even lie. These are common occurrences, and Paulogia has made this point before as well. On the other hand, we have never known someone truly dead return to life. Therefore, a reasonable person will conclude that the report is probably mistaken. Now, there are a number of problems with this argument. The first is, how do we know that we have never known someone truly dead return to life? How do you know that this is the case 200 years ago or back in the 1st century? Now, if you ask me whether have I seen anyone truly dead return to life, I would say no, but my testimony might be wrong. For example, I might have misremembered some things, and I cannot have observed what happens in the 1st century. Now, Paulogia might say, but we have repeated experience that dead people stays dead. However, repeated assumes that it has happened in the past as well as present, and that people remembered and testified the past experiences accurately. But didn't Ratios say, we know that often people get things wrong, make mistakes, exaggerate, and even lie? Aren't these common occurrences? Now, Paulogia might say, but we have photos of people staying dead. But Hume the skeptic might reply that photos can be forged and corpses can be misidentified. And those photos or corpses do not represent all the people who have ever lived. Perhaps many others have resurrected in the past, but these events were not correctly recorded because, as Rachel say, people often get things wrong. All right, so I have been using David Hume against David Hume here. That if you ask me, do you actually believe that dead people usually stay dead? I would say yes, of course. So what is the correct response to those objections? The correct response is, even though often people get things wrong, often people make mistakes, exaggerate, and even lie, yet it is improbable that multiple groups of people falsely testified that dead people stays dead usually. For example, even if individuals may misremember some things or exaggerate some details, others in the group of people can correct them. This implies that even though often people get things wrong, etc., nevertheless, there are conditions under which it is improbable that they testified falsely. And I argue that those conditions were in fact present in the case concerning Jesus' resurrection, concerning the case of Jesus' resurrection, that multiple groups of people saw him alive, as I argued in my book. This implies that we should never dismiss testimonial evidence based on general remarks such as often people get things wrong, make mistakes, etc. Rather, we should look into the details of specific instances and see whether there are conditions which make it improbable in those instances that people testified falsely on those occasions. Paulogia fails to note that science and history themselves rely upon testimony. As another philosopher, Cody, has pointed out in the book published by Oxford University Press, the judgments of others constitute an important, indeed perhaps the most important, test of whether my own judgments reflect a reality independent of my subjectivity. If I'm hallucinated, then the testimony of others will establish that fact, despite my firm convictions to the contrary. Science and history depends on observation. Establishing the reliability of scientific instruments, such as the camera, for example, also requires correlation with our observation. And one should not just depend on one's own observation, which is limited and could be hallucinatory. Rather, one needs confirmation from the experiences of others. And this confirmation can only be obtained ultimately by testimony alone. Therefore, testimony alone is an important source of knowledge. Now, Paulogia might object that, but we have never observed a dead person resurrected from the dead. And this was Rachel's second objection. However, the problem is that neither have we nor any scientists ever observed an event such as the Big Bang happen in front of us. Yet, most scientists believe that it probably happened in the past. Why? Because of the evidence. Now, Paulogia might object that these evidence are not based on testimony, but are based on measurements by scientific instruments. However, I have already explained earlier on that the reliability of scientific instruments ultimately depends on testimony. So it will be unscientific to exclude, on the basis of our limited experiences, without considering the evidence, the probability that an event which we don't observe now did happen in the past. Rather, we need to be open-minded to consider the evidence. Another problem with Hume's objection is that the objection against miracle based on infrequency is flawed. Why? Because infrequency does not equal improbability in the context of investigating a historical event which is supposed to be caused by a free agent, such as a supposed a claim of miracle. Well, infrequencies can help us exclude natural causes, given that natural causes are supposed to act in predictable and law-like ways. Infrequencies cannot help us exclude miracle, given that a miracle is supposed to be an event caused by a transcendent personal agent who might freely choose to act in certain ways only on rare occasions for special purposes. It's just like I seldom give flowers to girls, right? So this is a rare, this is something rare. It doesn't happen very often. But if that's the case, if my wife should observe flowers with the name Angeloke, right, attached to it, sent to her, should she disbelieve it just because it is something rare? No, of course not. Why? Because my wife is special, right? And I would give flowers to her on special occasions. So in a similar vein, right, if you ask, why didn't God resurrect Gautama, Buddha, or Confucius, or my grandmother? But why would he only resurrect Jesus? Well, the answer is because Jesus was special. And we have good reasons to think that he was special given the religious context, as I will explain later on. Right, so you cannot just argue that the prior probability for Jesus' resurrection is low just because resurrection as a whole is something infrequent. Why? Because God may have chosen to do a miracle, like resurrecting someone from the dead, only on special occasion, on a special people, a person, right? A special person such as Jesus. Now, another of Hume's objection is that it will be extremely difficult for us to gather sufficient evidence for a certain miracle because it has to be strong enough to overturn the laws of nature, which appear to be more consistent and uniform than anything else that we know of. However, this objection neglects the fact that evidence for laws of nature is only evidence for how nature behaves when it is left on its own. Whereas a miracle is supposed to be an event that happens when the natural world is not left on its own. The evidence for the former is irrelevant against the latter. To give an analogy, there have been millions of observations that human beings cannot fly without help. Now, suppose someone in the 9th century observed the engineer Abbas bin Firnas became the first human to fly with the help of a pair of wings built with silk. He jumped off a cliff from Yemen's mountain and glided for 10 minutes in the air. Now, do we need millions of observations of that event in order to conclude that humans flew with help? No, because the evidence for the laws of nature that humans cannot fly without help is irrelevant against the case that a human flew with help, right? So we only need to have evidence that someone actually saw Abbas flew, and to rule out alternative explanations. Say, for example, to rule out the explanation that the observer may have hallucinated. As long as we can do that, we can confirm that the event did happen. Likewise, the evidence that humans cannot resurrect without divine help is irrelevant against the case that Jesus resurrected with God's help. And we only need to have evidence that someone saw the resurrected Jesus and to rule out the alternative explanations. And that will be sufficient to conclude that Jesus truly resurrected. Now, there is another interpretation of Hume's argument against miracle, and this is known as the base rate fallacy. As Peter Millikan, a philosopher, puts it this way: suppose I want to know whether I suffer from some rare genetic condition G, which afflicts 1 in a million people. A test is available which seems reliable in that whoever is tested, the chance that the test will give a correct diagnosis is 99.9%. Now, suppose I am tested positive. How convinced should I be that I do have that condition? Now, Hume would say, consider whether is it more probable that this kind of test should be mistaken or that you should have that condition, G. Now, given that the test is wrong 1 time in 1,000, while G afflicts only 1 person in a million, there is clearly a far greater likelihood of a mistaken test than of my actually having the genetic disease G. And so a positive test does relatively little to indicate that I actually have that disease. Now, what's wrong with this objection against Jesus' resurrection? The first is that the case of a rare disease is disanalogous to the case concerning Jesus' resurrection. Because the former case, the probability is calculated based on the assumption that it is a random sample. That is, the chance of randomly finding a person who has that disease is very low. However, in the case of Jesus' resurrection, the probability is not that of randomly finding someone claiming to have seen a resurrected person and that person resurrected. We are not talking about finding a random person here. As Livia Magru puts it this way, nobody claims that God randomly raised a number of people to life in the world. So simply counting up the number of resurrections in the world is a ridiculous approach to consider Jesus' resurrection. It's a fallacious way to argue that the prior probability for Jesus' resurrection is low because it ignores the religious context concerning Jesus, which coincides with the evidence for his resurrection, and also that we are able to exclude the naturalistic alternatives in the case for Jesus' resurrection. And this brings me to the second point, which is that with regards to testing for a rare disease, saying that the chance of a person having that disease is very low, this is even though the test is positive, now this is too superficial and general. One should ask the deeper question of why the test would give a false positive in that case. What are the specific alternative explanations for a false positive result in that case? One possible explanation is that there could be other proteins, for example, other proteins in the blood, for example, which can also cause a positive result. However, if such alternative explanations can be excluded, then as long as the test shows a positive result, then the person has that disease, right? And likewise, we can eliminate the alternative explanations to Jesus' resurrection, as I've argued in my book, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, such that we can conclude that Jesus did rise from the dead, that it did happen, such an event did happen in the past. So, in conclusion, Paulogia's statement that the witness is lying or mistaken is always going to be more probable than a miracle happened based on the evidence from testimony alone is false because, firstly, it only considers testimonial evidence generally, but fails to consider the fact that there can be specific conditions in specific instances which makes it improbable that the witnesses falsely testified on those occasions. Secondly, it fails to consider the fact that testimony alone is an important source of knowledge for science and history, including our knowledge that dead people usually stay dead. Thirdly, it is unscientific to exclude, on the basis of our limited present experience, the probability that an event which we don't observe now did happen in the past. Fourthly, it fails to note that infrequency does not equal improbability in the context of investigating a historical event that is supposed to be caused by a free agent. Fifthly, it fails to note that the evidence for how nature behaves when it is left on its own is irrelevant against an event that is supposed to have happened when the natural world is not left on its own. And finally, the base rate interpretation of Hume's objection is a fallacious objection against Jesus' resurrection because it fails to consider issues concerning the reference class and the issues concerning the exclusion of alternative explanations. And therefore, Paulogia's and Hume's objection to miracles has been refuted. Now, does it mean that we therefore believe in any miraculous claim? Now, of course not. Rather, we should consider whether there is, firstly, religious context, secondly, evidence, and thirdly, whether the alternative naturalistic explanations can be ruled out. The unique feature concerning Jesus' resurrection is that, unlike many other miraculous claims, which are superstitions with no basis in history, the three conditions I mentioned earlier on are in fact fulfilled in the case concerning Jesus' resurrection. There is significant religious context, historical evidence, and the alternative naturalistic explanations are indeed ruled out, as I explained in my book, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, this book can be downloaded for free online, right? It's an open access book. Now, Paulogia has a second objection, which is that he says that hearsay increases the problem exponentially. However, the problem is that Paulogia has misinterpreted the evidence concerning Jesus' resurrection as hearsay. He has falsely claimed that that is hearsay, as I pointed out in our written debate and also in the first episode of What's Wrong with the Skeptic's Arguments, and also my debate review, where I pointed out that there are at least 80 errors in Paulogia's interpretations and arguments. So you can check it out. I will post a link to these resources below this video. So that's all for today's episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.